Welcome, everyone. My name is Balázs Ragai, and there are some facts about myself, which is probably most boring. So I would like to start this with a short poll, with a short raise of hands, please. Who of you think are familiar with the concept of data vault? Great. Who of you have worked on a project with data vault? Okay, thank you. And the same things for DBT. Who of you are familiar with the concept of DBT? Okay, much more hands, great. And worked on a project with DBT? Okay, I will try to tailor my presentation to this audience as much as I can. Okay, so about data vault, let's jump into it, because really 20 minutes is very short to summarize everything about data vault and also the benefits of working data vault with DBT together. So I will just give you a very high-level overview of data vault and the concept, the methodology for those who are probably not familiar with it or who have a different understanding, and I would like to just share with you my understanding of what data vault is. So data vault in general is an architecture. It's not just a modeling tool, which most people think who have heard about data vault. It's a complete architecture and a complete methodology to provide data solutions to our analytics users, to our companies that we work for. But let's look at the architecture step by step quickly. So first of all, the architecture resembles the medallion architecture that is so famous nowadays with the bronze, silver, and gold layer. There is a bronze layer which we can also call staging layer, where we have our data arriving. There is the data vault in the middle. So the silver layer is basically the data vault, and we will of course talk much more about that. And there is some sort of gold layer on top of it, which is sometimes called information delivery or information marts or data marts or whatever. So a layer where you provide the data to your end users. And okay, let's take a step. The most important thing about data vault, in my understanding, is that you have to work together with the business. You have to identify the objects, the keys, the data that is most important to the business. And you also have to identify the transformation rules that you want to apply to your data during your pipeline, during the data pipeline. And there are so-called hard rules and there are so-called soft rules. The hard rules are the rules that you use during the loading, during the ingestion, let's say between the bronze and the silver layer. And they should be reversible. So you should always keep 100% of the data, of the meaning of the data that you receive from the source. And also they should be something that doesn't change the meaning of the data. So it's usually data type conversion. For example, date should be a date, a flag should be a flag, and let's consolidate that we always use yes or no or whatever for a date. These are the hard rules. And anything that the business is defining for us, how they want to understand the data, how they want to use the data, they are the so-called soft rules. And they should be implemented in a different step. We will come to that later. Okay, in the raw data vault and in the data vault, we have a specific data model that we want to create, and I will go to that a little bit later. Then come the so-called soft rules. So this is what I've already talked about. So once we have our raw data vault, we will apply the soft rules, the business rules, the transformations that the business define, and create our business vault, or we will directly use the raw data vault and you apply these soft rules to the raw data vault and create the information delivery layer, create the information mart. That's the overview, very, very high level overview in 3 minutes of a data vault architecture. Okay, let's look at the model, because the gist of it, the most important thing in it is the model itself. In the model, as I already said, the most important first step is to identify the business objects and the business keys that our business is talking about. In the example here that you can see, it's about flights and airports and carriers. You identify the three objects that our business is most talking about: airports, flights, carriers, and they become the so-called hubs. Hubs are the objects in the data vault model where you only store the business key. You only store the the identifier that the business is going to understand, the business is going to use when identifying these business objects. And you also hash it, so you use a hash key, you generate a hash key out of this business key for different purposes, which is way too complicated to go into in 5 minutes. But you need to understand that we, according to the data vault methodology, we apply a hashing algorithm, we create hash keys out of these business keys that we identified. Okay, the next things in the data vault model are the so-called links. So when we identify that there is some sort of relation between business objects, carriers, flights, and airports, there are flights that are related to all of these, then we create so-called links. The links are, again, nothing else than collections of business keys, collections of the business keys of the hubs that the links is linking together, a link is linking together, sorry. And of course, we again create a hash key out of those business keys, and we again have a table. It's important to understand that hubs and links are very, very, very strict in structure. They only have the business key, the hash key, and a couple of technical columns which will help us identify the source, the date when we receive this data, and things like that. But that's it, no other attribute in a hub or a link table. And any descriptive attribute that we want to add, that we want to use to describe our hubs or even our links, go to so-called satellite tables. The satellite tables are a collection of the descriptive attributes of whatever they are linked to, whatever they are attached to. We use the hash key of the hub or the link to link it, and we also calculate a so-called hash diff. So it's a methodology to help identify the differences, to help us identify in a batching environment, for example, if the data that we receive today is different from the data that we received yesterday. And if it's different, then of course we do some loading, and if it's not different, if it's the same, then of course we avoid loading anything. And you can also see here in this example that in most of the cases, a hub or a link can have multiple or even many satellites. That's what we call satellite split. So the data that is linked to an airport, for example, in this example, can be split according to different attributes of the data, like frequency. So we have a data source that changes frequently, and we have another data, or in the same data source we have attributes that change very rarely. Then it's probably a good idea to put them into separate satellites. But definitely if we have data for the same business object coming from two different sources, we should create two separate satellites, because it helps with all the additional processing and all the downstream and also all the future improvements and all the future additions that we need to do. But there is another example for satellite split. For example, GDPR. So you want to separate your customers' personal information from the non-personal descriptive information, because it makes it easier to anonymize them later, delete the personal information in the request. So there are a lot of ideas, a lot of cases why it's a good idea to split satellites, and for the same hub or link have multiple satellites. That's the very, very basic of data vault modeling, and I'm not hoping that anyone has a better understanding now than when they came. If yes, then that's good. Okay, now to start to understand why data vault and DBT is a good combination, in my opinion, let's look at two challenges that we usually face on a data vault related project. And the two challenges are usually, from an engineering point of view, is that we want to automate our data vault layer. So we want to create and automate our data vault layer as quick as possible, as standardized as possible, and so on. So we want to use some sort of automation tool. There are many on the market that will create our data vault layer according to the standards as quick as possible. And then the other challenge is the information delivery. So, okay, we have a perfect data vault model. We have a perfect intermediate silver layer where we have our data vault and our data. But how do we deliver the data to the business? And that's usually the other challenge. And to be honest, that's the part where most of the automation tools are lacking, in my opinion. But let's see the challenges. So when you want to automate your data vault, you want it to be according to standards. you want your work to be agile and repeatable. So yeah, the format of a data vault model is strict. So it helps very much with automation, with agile and repeatable delivery. But we also want to keep our data auditable, have the full lineage and so on. So have all the information tracing back the data to the source that we store in the data vault. And also full history is part of what we want our data vault layer to serve. So to have the full history of the data, regardless of changes, regardless of any issues. The good news is, when we want to understand why DBT is a good combination, is that there are DBT packages, and I will show you later in the demonstration, one of them. There are DBT packages that are prepared for this. So there are in DBT packages to automate creating your data vault layer. On the other hand, when you are trying to deliver the data to your customers, you need to work quickly and incremental together with your analytics team. You have to be flexible, and you also need to have you need to provide some sort of good performance in your data. And those of you who use DBT, we all know that this is what analytics engineering stands for. This is what DBT has originally, why DBT was originally created, to enable a quick, flexible cooperation with the analytics team, with some analytics or data engineers, and deliver the information layer quickly. So this is the benefit of DBT out of the box. Let's look at the other part, the data vault layer. Okay, so as I said, there are two packages that I know of. There may be others, but these are the two that I know of. One of them is called Automate DV. Formerly, it was also called DBT Vault. There is a URL when you can find it. It has all the benefits of an automation package. So it enables you template-driven, automated delivery. Everything will be out of the box, similar. Out of the box, it will generate the same codes. It will give you all the benefits of an automation of a data vault layer. And the same for data vault for DBT. Data vault for DBT was created by Scalable, a German consulting company focusing on data vault. Probably this is, I don't really want to differentiate between the two. This is closer to standards. This has 100% all the standards of Data Vault 2.0. And the other one has probably a little bit more features, probably a little bit more documentation, probably a little bit easier to use. So we will use the first one for the demo, but it's important to understand that both are perfect for generating the 95% of your data vault in DBT. Okay, so we will use Automate DV. Let's quickly go through. So I will use the well-known JFL example. I hope all of you are familiar with JFL. It's the demo database that DBT provides for all of its trainings. So we have some information from JFL orders and customers, and we also have some information from Stripe, which are the payments for the orders. Very, very simple data model: orders, customers, and payments for the orders. That's the example that we will work with. On the landing zone, we will just simply create objects, models, that will just load this data from the source. That's simple. Let's look at orders, for example. I don't know how much you can see of it, but there is an ID, which is the order ID. There is a user ID, which identifies the customer. There is an order data, and there is a status, and there is some technical field when this data was loaded. And this is the sort of model that we want to create. So on top of the orders, we want to do some staging. That's where we want to apply the hard rules. And then we want to create a hub, a hub for customers, a hub for orders, a link between orders and customers, and the satellite that is going to be linked to the orders, because that's going to contain the detail. It's a very, very simple model, I know. But for the demonstration purposes, it's perfect because we will be able to see everything. Okay, staging layer. On the left-hand side, you can see the code that you need to create in DBT. On the right-hand side, you can see the compiled code that the package is going to create for you. So what can we see on the left-hand side? And this is way too much to go through one by one. But there are some derived columns, so you can define first of all, you define your source, sorry. You define your source that it is coming from row orders. That was the previous model that I have shown you. Okay, so we can do some derived columns, renaming columns like customer ID. So user ID should be called customer ID. We add a record source where this data is coming from. I don't know, the load date should be a technical date that is coming from the source. So you can even here define technical columns. And then come all the different technical details of your data vault that is going to be built on this source. What is going to be the order hash key? So what is the business key for the order? It's the ID. What is the customer hash key? It's the user ID. What is the hash key for the link that we will create between order and customer? What is the so-called hash diff? So the hash value that I mentioned to identify the changes in a satellite. We want to create it. What should be the columns in it? And then just a simple macro call. With all these parameters, we will call a macro which will create a stage object for us in dbt. So that's the part that you need to create. Of course, there are ways to automate even this. If you have a modeling tool like, I don't know, Power Designer, then you can generate something like this. But this is the sort of input that you need to do. And then the package, the automate DV, is going to create for you this code. You can see the constants are included, and probably the important parts are here, the hash key generations with all the different MD5 hash generation, and so on, and so on, and so on. This is a very simple example, but all the necessary hard rules, all the necessary constants and everything can be generated this way. Okay, and now that we have a staging layer where we already applied our hard rules, so we applied some very simple hard rules, renaming columns for standardization, or the constants for the record source or the date. Let's see how we can create data vault objects out of this. So what we are doing here is creating a hub, creating the order hub. We will use the stage orders that we created on the previous slide as a source. We just identify which is the primary key, the hash key, which is the business key, which is the load date, which is the record source, and create a hub. So once you have your staging layer, it's very, very simple, and it needs to be incremental. I don't have time to explain why, but I think you will understand that it will always just add the new records that are created. And this is the simple code that is going to be generated. It is going to identify one and only one order from the source, and then check if it already exists in the target table. If it does, then don't do anything. If it doesn't, then insert the data. That's what we do in a hub. Same for links. Here we are generating a link. Yeah, it's exactly the same. The business keys are 2, so there are 2 business keys, but the source is the same. All the other parameters are the same, and even the code for the link is similar to how a hub is generated. And finally, let's create a satellite. It's a bit more complicated, because here you will need to identify the so-called payload. So you will need to say which are the attributes, which are the columns from the staging layer that you want to load as a payload. You have your hash diff, how you want to compare it, all the technical columns previously, and again, nothing else, just generate the satellite. The code for a satellite is a bit too complicated to fit on a screen, because it has a lot of things. It checks if the data already exists. It checks if the hash key is different. It even checks if there are multiple records for the same business key in the source. Then in some sort of order, it will load all of the changes. So if you on the same load, you will have multiple records with different attributes, then it will load it one by one, and so on. But, so to invoke, to create a satellite, it's, again, as simple as you can see. And one last thing, in this model, if you want to create a customer hub, then the methodology or the standards say that there are 2 sources where you receive customers from, the customer itself and the order, where you also have customer ID. And you also need to do something with the mismatch. So if there is an order that doesn't have a customer, you also need to do something. What you do is you anyway create the customer record in the hub. And that's, again, very simple. You just define two sources for the hub, for the customer, and it will automatically do all the necessary things. When you generate the code, it will check if one or the other or both has the same customer, and then load the data accordingly. That was it. The purpose of this presentation was to show you that automating a data vault in dbt is fairly simple. And then, after you have a well-designed and well-created data vault, then building the information mart on top of it is something that dbt is for. So the combination of the two, in my opinion, works perfect in a data vault environment. Thank you.